I can see that we already have quite a few people joining us. We are going to get started in just about a minute. You see a poll question up on your screen. Thank you for being on with us today. Please feel free to answer that poll question at your convenience. We're going to leave it on, or leave it up, I should say, just for a little bit. And again, in about 30 seconds, we'll introduce the event, go over some troubleshooting, and then I'll hand this over to our speaker. So thank you to those who have joined so quickly this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you are joining us from. Okay. Well, thank you for being on with us today. My name is Jessica Hunt. I am one of the owners of E&E Leader. It is always a pleasure to work with the team from Montrose Environmental. Today, we have a fantastic speaker who has been on with us many times, Jami Patrick. She's going to be talking about navigating the rapidly changing world of climate-related disclosures, because as we all know, if we're in this space, things change sometimes on a weekly basis, monthly basis, depending on where you're located in the world. So always important to stay on top of everything. If you are jumping in, you will see a poll question up on your screen right now. Please answer that at your convenience. We will have some other poll questions on during today's event, so we do appreciate all of the attendees' active participation. Do not worry though, because we will also have time for Q&A with Jami after her presentation. And if for some reason we don't get to your question, she will get back in touch with you, or the team for Montrose will as well. I do believe we mentioned this in our reminder email, but a copy of the slide deck will be available to all attendees after the event in a follow-up email for Montrose. So don't feel like you have to take notes. Sit back, listen to Jami, write some questions down, and submit them during the event. If you have any questions at all, please submit them using the Q&A button. The chat feature is really just for you to let our team know where you're joining from. We'd love to know if we're located near anybody or where we have people joining from around the world. So at this point, I am going to turn the presentation over to Jami, and we hope to be able to answer a lot of your questions today. So thank you so much, Jami, and you're up.
All right. Thanks, Jessica. Appreciate that. And thanks everyone for joining today. Really, really happy to be here. As Jessica said, my name is Jami Patrick, and I lead the Sustainability and Climate Advisory team at Montrose Environmental Group. I'm based in Nashville, Tennessee, and I've been working in this environmental and sustainability space for almost 30 years, and mostly as a consultant and an advisor with clients. If you haven't heard of Montrose, we are about 3,100 employees strong, and we are a environmental services, consulting, and advisory firm. You can see here we're largely based in North America and Canada, but do have some overseas operations as well. Many of you might know us from some of our roots, stack testing company, but we now provide really a full range of environmental and sustainability services. So I've just kind of thrown up on the screen here a little bit of what we do. And I kind of work a lot in this space. So helping clients with sustainability strategy, sustainability disclosures, and then a little bit of deep dive work on climate. So again, really excited to be here today. So we're going to get started. Just in general, how we're going to work today is we're going to talk a little bit about the basics. We're going to talk about climate change, what the difference between climate impacts and climate risk is, and really just get everyone familiar with the terminology and the basics. And then we'll go a little bit forward and we'll jump into the actual regulations and standards that we want to talk about today. So before we get started, Jessica, I think we have another poll that's going to pop up. Is that right?
Yep,
Excellent.
and it is up
Okay.
right now.
Awesome. So we just wanted to get a sense kind of before we dive in here, where folks are in their understanding of greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, your understanding of climate risk, transition risk, physical risk. That'll just help us understand who our audience is and help me tailor the message a little bit. So we're going to leave that up on the screen for a moment, and then Jessica's going to share results with us as well. Um, Interesting side note, while I'm loving seeing kind of where folks are based in the chat here. Really glad to see some folks from all around the world joining the webinar today. All right, excellent. So I think everyone can see the results there. So we've got a bit about, a little under half of the folks, about 40% of the folks who feel like they've got a solid understanding, but really a good 63% or so either, don't feel like you've got a good foundation, or maybe you're just starting to understand. So that's great. Again, we're gonna really kick this off with some foundational understanding and awareness around climate change and what that means from kind of a corporate perspective. All right, so here we go. So the first thing I want to talk about is when we talk about climate change, again, in this kind of corporate perspective, we're really talking about climate change through two different lenses. So the first lens is climate impact. And I think this is an area that a lot of folks are maybe more familiar with. So companies and individuals, we do things every day that impact the environment, including activities that result in emissions of greenhouse gases into the environment that are contributing to climate change. So what companies can do is really get their arms around what their impact is by undertaking something called a greenhouse gas inventory. So calculating what your greenhouse gas emissions are. And there's an organization and a document, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, that really provides the standard for the methodology to be used for this quantification of emissions. And then just like the phrase, you can't manage what you don't measure, once you understand what your impact is as an organization, that really provides a good foundation for setting goals and targets for emissions reduction, decarbonization, and for many companies, working towards net zero GHG emissions, okay? So that's climate impact. That's the impact that a company has on the environment. But there's another lens that we really need to look through that is very well represented in these new climate-related disclosure requirements that I want to make sure we also have a good foundational understanding of, and that is climate risk. So when we talk about climate risk, think about that lens going the other direction. So the world is changing, right? Temperatures are rising, so we're having physical changes in our environment. But the world is also changing in other ways. We are transitioning towards a low carbon economy. And so because of these changes, both those physical changes and these transitional changes, those changes can often pose risks and opportunities to organizations. And we'll talk a little bit about some examples, but you know, physical risks very easy to understand, wildfires, drought, flooding, et cetera. But there are also risks that are posed to companies as this world is moving towards a low carbon economy. And then these risks and these opportunities, those all have a potential to financially impact a business, and through that financial impact, really impact the resiliency or the longevity of a business. So it's really important that companies understand not just the impact that they're having on climate change, but the impact and the risk that climate change poses to an organization. And here, just like the GHG protocol is kind of the standard, the methodology for measuring greenhouse gas emissions, there's a task force called the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD, that has really set forth recommendations for disclosing information or reporting information around what risks your company might face, what you're doing to manage those, and what the financial impact of those might be. Okay, so again, basics, impact, and risk. So we're going to just quickly dive into each one of those in a little bit more detail, and then we're going to jump into what regulations and frameworks have popped up in the last couple of years that are really driving a lot of change for how companies have to report these publicly. So for those of you who answered that you have a solid understanding, you will no doubt recognize this diagram. It's pretty iconic when we talk about climate impact or greenhouse gas emissions. So this diagram comes from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol reporting standards, and it really spells out the different types of greenhouse gas emissions. So for those of you who already know and understand this, forgive me, but I'd like to just take a moment and make sure we've got really common understanding across the participants here about what we're talking about when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions. So through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, there are three categories or scopes of emissions that companies are emitting and creating impact, and this is how we measure those emissions as well. So you'll see on the diagram, scope 1 emissions are a company's direct emissions. So think about this in two ways. These are emissions due to combustion of fuel, either at a company's assets, buildings, plants, facilities, or through a company's fleet. But it also includes emissions through things like refrigerants and other fluorinated gases that, while they might seem minimal, really have a much more powerful impact on climate change. So we also measure those as part of a company's direct emissions. So those are your scope 1 emissions within your footprint. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions, largely from purchased electricity, or in some cases, if you're purchasing other means of heating or cooling or steam for your own use. Why are these separated? Well, if you think about it, that electricity that you're using as an organization, you're not generating that electricity typically on site. That's getting generated at a power plant. So while it's not a direct emission, your use of that electricity has a direct impact on the climate. So we calculate and quantify those emissions from that electricity that you purchase. And then lastly, we have scope 3 emissions. You might hear these called value chain emissions, but these are the emissions that have to do with everything in your supply chain and your value chain. So everything from kind of the sourcing of raw materials, transportation of materials, everything coming into, let's say if you're a manufacturing facility, a manufacturing plant. It includes some things like business travel and employee commuting. Then it also includes everything that happens kind of after the plant. So again, if you're manufacturing widgets, it has to do with the emissions that are related to the transportation of those widgets to maybe the store where they're sold, and then how those are used by the end user and how those are disposed of. So you can see it's kind of a very broad category of scope 3 emissions. But we're going to talk a little bit because some of these regulations and rules require you to report scope 3 emissions, some don't. So I just wanted to make sure everyone really understands those basics of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Okay, so again, that's GHG impact. These definitions come to us from the GHG protocol. Now, on the other side of the fence, when we're talking about climate risk, remember I said that a body called the TCFD put together a set of final recommendations that really provide the de facto standard for how companies should identify, assess, manage risk, and then report on its financial impact as well. So I know from talking to clients that when we talk about climate risk, it can feel a little intangible. So I wanted to share kind of directly from the TCFD recommendations, what some of the things that, some examples of what climate risks might be. And as I said earlier, I think it's really easy to grasp the concept of a physical climate risk. So what might happen to my facility or my pipelines or my supply chain because of flooding, drought, increased severity of storms, et cetera. So that's your physical climate risk. But as I mentioned before, there are also transition risks. So a good example from the screen here is in this transition to a low carbon economy, we're seeing a lot of end users, let's say consumers, their buying habits are changing and they want to know more about how green a product is, or they're going to base their buying preferences on what is a low carbon product. So you can see that these buying preferences could pose a risk to an organization if they don't have line of sight of what's coming as far as consumer preference and then what financial impact that could have. So again, these are a little bit less tangible, but just think about these as the risks to your business because of the transition to a low carbon economy. Now, the good news is that it isn't all risk-based, right? So this transition to a low carbon economy also provides a lot of opportunities for organizations to differentiate yourself, to identify what those changing trends might be and offer products and services that maybe will become more in demand because of this transition. So when we put these all together, we're talking about climate-related risks and climate-related opportunities. And again, the rules and the regulations and the frameworks that we're going to look at in a moment here, they really talk a lot about what the requirements are for reporting these risks publicly. So again, this is just a good kind of foundational element here of what we're talking about when we talk about climate-related risks and opportunities. All right, so that's Climate Change 101 from a corporate perspective. We are going to now dive deeper into the new and emerging climate-related disclosure requirements and frameworks. But before we do that, Jessica, I think you're going to put yet another poll on the screen. And what we want to do here is kind of before we start diving into what some of these rules and frameworks are, just these rules and frameworks, they're all about disclosure or publicly reporting on emissions and risk. And so we wanted to get a sense about you and the organization that you work with or you represent. Is your company already publicly reporting on your emissions and your climate-related risk, or maybe just your emissions or just your risk? So really want to get a sense for what the kind of current status is for some of this reporting within the organizations that you all represent. So let's give it a moment here and we'll see the results come in. And here we go. Great. Wow, quite a spread for sure. So looking at kind of the pure yes and the pure no, about an even split. And as I would expect, we have a lot of organizations that maybe have taken that first step of reporting on their greenhouse gas emissions, maybe even just their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions to start, but haven't really delved into reporting on the climate risk side of things, again, because that's a little bit less tangible. So we're going to talk about the rules, what they require related to both GHG emissions and climate risks today. So it'd be interesting to see kind of how folks who haven't done this yet can learn a little bit about what this process is. Okay, so let's dive in here. For anyone who's been, kind of listening to the news or kind of paying attention to what's going on in this space, there are kind of 3 major sets of rules, regulations, directives that have really moved the needle and created a step change when it comes to requirements around publicly reporting on climate impact and climate risk. For a long time, reporting your GHG emissions was in the realm of the voluntary. These rules are really starting to make that shift to push companies to report these things on a more mandatory basis. So there's a set of rules from the US SEC. There's 2 rules or 2 bills that have come out of the state of California. And there is a directive that's come out of the EU that also has a potential to impact US companies. So we're going to talk about the 3 of these today, just kind of boil them down to understand what they require and who they're applicable to. It's also important to keep in mind that I guess all 3 of these requirements are underpinned by either frameworks or standards that really provide a little bit more detail as to the what that needs to be reported. So we can't really talk about the rules themselves without talking about some of these requirements and standards that provide some foundation for those rules. So again, everything you see on the screen here today, we're just gonna knock them off one by one and talk a little bit about what they are, who they apply to, and what the impact of those rules might be. Okay, so let's start with the US SEC Security and Exchange Commission's climate-related rules. So earlier this year, the SEC published climate rules that apply to all companies that are publicly traded in the US, with really very little, if any, exemptions at all. And these rules require reporting on both climate impact and on climate risk. Now, notable here, the SEC rules only require companies to report on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions were not included in the final rule. And just like we said before, those emissions have to be calculated according to the GHG protocol. And when disclosing risk, that's done in alignment with the TCFD recommendations or anything kind of similar to those. Really interesting timing wise here. If you look at the timing, again, these apply to public companies in the US. So if you're a large accelerated filer, you are the first up to have to report on your climate risk with your FY 2025 reporting to the SEC. And then you have to report on your Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions the year following. So very interesting. I think folks have gotten really hung up on the GHG emissions part of it, but with the SEC rules, the requirements around reporting climate risk in accordance with TCFD, those requirements actually kick in before the GHG emissions requirements kick in. So really important to think about when you're planning for how you're going to comply with these rules. There's also limited assurance or verification required on sets of data. Again, phases in depending on your filing status. So again, if you're not familiar with what status, filing status your company is, take a look at your investor page on your company website, and you should see your SEC filings there, things like your 10K, and you can look in those to see what your filing status is. If you're a large accelerated filer, an accelerated filer, or there's some smaller categories as well. If you're not a publicly traded company, these in the US, these don't apply to you. And if you are one of these smaller categories of publicly traded companies, you only have to report on climate-related risk, not on your greenhouse gas emissions. We'll talk a little bit about the current status of these rules. Yes, they are currently stayed, but I'll hit on that a little bit later. Let's just talk a little bit about the requirements first. Okay, so that's the US SEC rules. You may have heard as well that the state of California has issued similar Senate bills that, again, cover both climate impact and climate risk. So these are two separate bills, one focusing on each. The California bill, SB 253, really focuses on climate impact, and it requires annual reporting of greenhouse gas emissions, again, according to the GHG protocol. What's different here from the SEC rules is that the California rules require reporting on Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So again, a little bit of a heavier lift and a wider scope here. So who has to comply with this California rule? This rule applies to companies that are doing business in California that have a total annual revenue of greater than 1 billion. Now, this isn't revenue generated in the state of California. This is total revenue for the organization. So if you're a company that does business in California and you have a total revenue annually of greater than 1 billion, this rule will apply to you. And then I've included some information at the bottom here as far as timeline. So in 2026, companies will be required to report their 2025 Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and those will have to have limited assurance or some external verification on that data. And then the following year in 2027, with the FY 2026 reporting, you'll have to roll in Scope 3 emissions. So These years might feel a little bit far off, but if you think about it, we're 7 months away from 2025 beginning. So really not too far in the future. So that's SB 253. California also issued SB 261, and together these are the climate accountability package. So SB 261 focuses more on the climate risk side of things, and this bill will require that companies every other year prepare a climate-related financial risk report. And this report, just like we were talking about earlier, will serve to be a place where companies publicly disclose what are their climate-related risks, what are they doing to address those risks, what potential financial impact might those risks have, and how do they plan to adapt to risks as well. So according to this rule, you can see the revenue threshold for being pulled into the applicable reporting for this rule is lower. So here, if you are a company that's doing business in California and you have a total annual revenue of 500 million or greater, you will be required to comply with Senate Bill 261 and its implementing regulations. So although these are just reports that are published on your company's website, they're not necessarily submitted through any portal. The state of California, through the California Air Resources Board, will be appointing an advisory group to review those reports and determine whether or not they're in line with requirements. Now, a quick note here, state of California, the California Air Resource Board is meant to be releasing its implementing regulations around these the 1st of January 2025. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the state of that in a bit. Okay, now the final of the 3 climate-related rules that, again, have kind of popped up in the last couple of years. This is a rule that American companies might kind of think they can ignore, but it's the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD. And it's very important to note that just because your company might be US-based, it does not mean that you might not get pulled into the CSRD. Now, the applicability here is a little bit more complicated, so I've laid it out on this slide, but I'm sure it also raises a lot of questions. But suffice it to say that a US company that generates more than 150 million euros of net revenue in the EU for the last 2 consecutive years and meets one of those 3 requirements in the sub-bullets, you will be subject to CSRD. And for most US companies, those requirements will come into effect. The first reports will be due in 2029. Again, seems like it's far off, but CSRD is a huge regulation that actually covers not just climate, but covers all aspects of E, S, and G under this umbrella of sustainability. And companies have to do something called a double materiality assessment to determine what specific E, S, and G topics are potentially material to their business, and therefore they have to report on. Okay, so that's a CSRD big picture. When it comes to climate, today we're really just focusing in on climate-related disclosure rules. Within the European Union, there is a European sustainability reporting standard that is specifically on climate reporting. And again, like you're seeing in these other rules, it sets out the standards or the requirements for reporting both on climate impact and climate risk. So you should be seeing a trend here in what these climate-related disclosures are touching on. So if a company deems that climate change is a material issue, which is likely for many, if not most organizations, then that company under CSRD is required to disclose on climate impact and climate risk in accordance with this ESRS E1. And this standard includes scope 3, just like the California rule does. And what's interesting to note is that this European standard actually is built upon the back of 2 other standards that have kind of come in a little bit earlier. So the last standards we're going to look at, and I know there's a lot of acronyms and a lot to digest here, but we talked earlier about the TCFD. Again, foundational. This is a task force that published recommendations in 2017. These recommendations touched on kind of 4 different pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And underneath these pillars, there are actual recommendations, or you can say requirements, for what must be disclosed when it comes to, again, largely focused on climate risk. Now, if you haven't heard, the TCFD, the task force itself, has been disbanded. So if you were to go to the TCFD website right now, there's a big banner across the top. The TCFD as a body no longer exists. Its recommendations are, still out there. They're still valid, but the TCFD is no longer overseeing those recommendations. Instead, the TCFD has handed off kind of oversight of the TCFD recommendations to, to the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and that board has published a standard called IFRS S2. Again, a lot of acronyms, don't worry, we're going to include an acronym guide when we send these slides out after the webinar. So this standard, IFRS S2, really incorporates TCFD and expands on it in some areas. And then, as I said before, the EU CSRD, if climate is a material topic, that standard, ESRS E1, also largely incorporates IFRS S2. I want to mention something very interesting that I think there was a news article that just came out in the last maybe couple of weeks, but the purpose of this IFRS S2 standard, and there's a corresponding IFRS S1 standard that covers sustainability more broadly, these were published because they are intended to be standards that can be used globally by individual jurisdictions. So these standards, the IFRS standards, they're not necessarily requirements as a standalone document, but we're seeing different jurisdictions, i.e. the European Union, or individual countries, take these standards and adopt them into their regulations. So the ESRS E1 standard is for all intents and purposes, it's the EU kind of adopting IFRS S2 as its standard. Anyway, the news article that came out recently announced that over 20 different jurisdictions, generally speaking countries, have either already adopted the IFRS S2 and S1 standards into their own regulations, or they are in the process of considering that. And those 20 jurisdictions combined represent more than, or about 55% of the global economy by GDP. So this is huge. This standard, again, if you haven't heard of it before, it's really taking hold very quickly and really is on track to become the de facto climate reporting standard. Okay, we're going to hit a couple FAQs because I'm not necessarily monitoring the Q&A, but when I talk to my clients, these are the questions I undoubtedly get almost in every conversation. So, all right, Jamie, listen, my company's small, like we're an office-based company. We hardly have any GHG emissions. It's so insignificant compared to all these industrial companies. I don't really need to report, do I? The answer is yes. So the thresholds for these rules, all of these rules, have nothing to do with the amount of your emissions. They have to do, as we talked about, the thresholds are typically either revenue-based or, for example, in the example of the SEC rules, if you're a public related company. So there's no such thing as I have a small amount of emissions, I don't need to report. You are still subject to these rules despite what your emissions level might be. Another question that I get, all right, Jamie, doing business in California, like we don't have any offices there, we don't have any manufacturing facilities there. Do we really have to comply with these California standards? Or maybe the bigger question is, what the heck is doing business in California mean anyway? Well, This is a little complicated. As I said earlier, the California Air Resources Board, they haven't issued their implementing regulations yet, so we don't know specifically how they're going to define doing business in California. But if we look at other California regulations, these definitions are very broad. So for example, the California Corporations Code just says if you are entering into repeated and successive transactions in the state, you're doing business. We can also look at the California Franchise Tax Board that actually has some thresholds, financial thresholds about doing business in California, but they are very low. It's sales exceeding about $700,000 or payroll comp, i.e. maybe remote employees, exceeding $70,000. So again, we don't know what CARB is going to define as doing business in California, but just be prepared. That definition is going to be very broad. So if you are transacting in California, even if you don't have assets there, it is very likely that you might get pulled into these rules as well. Privately held companies. I work with some clients who are privately held companies. Do you need to apply with these rules? Well, some. So the SEC rule is specifically geared towards publicly traded companies in the US. But the California rule with those 500 million and 1 billion thresholds, those apply whether you are a private company or a public company. So yes, if you are a privately held company, you do still need to pay attention to the California climate risk and climate impact rules, and potentially the European rules, depending on the structure of your business. And then lastly, what's the status? If you're reading the newspaper, you're seeing what's happening with the SEC rules, what's happening with the climate-related rules in California. So yes, the SEC rules are stayed. The SEC voluntarily paused the implementation of their rules because there were kind of lawsuits and other challenges to those rules. So the SEC said, okay, we're going to pause on this. These challenges are now going in front of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. We don't know yet when they're going to hear that, or of course what the outcome is going to be, but the SEC is very clear that they are going to continue vigorously defending these rules in court, and that they intend to push forward with their implementation. So let's not take solace in the fact that they're being challenged. Maybe it'll impact the timing of the rules, but not necessarily whether or not they will be implemented. Similarly, in the state of California, you may have heard that in the budget this year for the state of California, there wasn't ample budget allocated for CARB, the Air Resources Board, to develop and implement the rules that they have to develop by January 1st in order to implement the requirements in these Senate bills. What does that mean? Again, does not mean that we can ignore these or that they're going to go away. It simply means that the dates that I showed you on earlier slides, yes, maybe they'll get pushed out a year, but these rules are not going away. It's really more a matter of implementation. Okay, so that's a little bit about the different rules, who they apply to, what they require. I don't know, when you look at those dates, again, I know some people might be seeing dates like 2025, 2026, 2029. You know, why are we talking about these now? What's the urgency? And I just really want to make sure that folks understand that meeting the requirements of these rules, they are reporting rules, but it's not as simple as just writing a report. There's a lot of work that has to go into kind of doing the things that need to be reported. So determining the impact, determining the risk. And even before doing that, of course, as an organization, if you've never kind of delved into this world before, it will be very important before you start anything to make sure that you've got your leadership team, key functional leaders, key operational leaders, you know, they have understanding of what these rules are, and that leadership team is really supportive and has bought into what needs to be done in order to comply with these rules. And then again, these rules, some of those requirements are complicated. So again, rather than just diving in, it will take some time to really map out, okay, who is accountable and responsible for doing some of these things to be able to make these reports, and who has oversight of that, and how are we going to govern that? And then with that in place, again, not to overwhelm folks, but one of the first things that companies want to do, let's take the example of greenhouse gas emissions inventories. I'm working with a client right now where we are undertaking their scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas inventory. Feels very straightforward. Okay, company, let us know, your electricity use in your different buildings, and the miles driven or the gasoline use in your vehicles, and we can calculate your emissions. We are now maybe 6 weeks into this project, and this organization is still getting their arms around what assets they have. And I know this sounds very elemental, but sometimes a greenhouse gas inventory, it's one of the first times companies really are creating kind of a master asset list: buildings, leased and owned, vehicles, other mobile equipment, and that takes time. So before we even get into calculating emissions, it'll take some time to just get an understanding of what those assets are, and then who are the people that you might need to talk to in order to get the data that you need to calculate emissions. And then you have to go and gather that data and find out, okay, is this data complete? Is it of good quality? Are there assumptions that we might need to make because we don't have data? And then you can go calculate your GHG emissions. So even on the scope 1, scope 2, and of course scope 3 emission side, there's a lot of work to be done up front. And then on the risk side, again, it's not, people talk about TCFD sometimes as a reporting framework. And while it is, I think it does the TCFD a disservice, because really it is a process, or it drives a process for identifying what are those climate-related risks and opportunities that an organization might face. Again, whether those are physical risks and we model those risks, or they're transition risks. What might the financial impact of those risks be under different climate scenarios, meaning, what different kind of warming scenarios there might be. And then once you understand those risks, opportunities, and financial impacts, what is the company going to do to actually manage those risks and adapt to some of these risks driven by climate change? So again, while the reporting standards or these disclosure standards are all about a report, there's a lot of work that has to go into kind of doing the things that need to get done so that you can then prepare the report. So just really, really important to know that there's a lot of effort that's required. And I would really encourage you, if you haven't kind of taken that first step yet, now is really the time to get started. Okay, so how do you start? And, quite simply, you're going to eat the elephant one bite at a time, if you've heard that expression before. If you take all of this together, and it can be very overwhelming, I completely understand. And so take this in small chunks and take it one step at a time. So what I would really encourage folks to do is look at these different rules and requirements together comprehensively to determine, okay, which ones are applicable to us now or potentially in the future? What are the requirements of those rules that are applicable to us? And again, look at these together, because there's so much overlap with these different reporting requirements. And then take a look at, okay, now we understand the requirements. What are we already doing that meets those requirements? What do we need to do to meet the requirements we aren't already meeting? And then again, very much like a management system, plan, do, check, act. Then you develop a plan to figure out how you're going to meet those. You're going to build capacity. You're going to promote awareness and training. You're going to get resources together. And then you're going to, kind of jump in. And again, a important underlying point is making sure that you have kind of robust and systematic approaches to managing that data. Again, can feel very overwhelming. Eat the elephant one bite at a time. I've slightly taken this quote out of context, but this is a quote from Walt Disney that the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. And I know that's very simple, but please don't let all these requirements overwhelm you. Really take it one step at a time. Okay. So with that, I just want to recap on a couple of key takeaways, and then we'll open this up for Q&A. What did we learn today? Well, I hope the biggest takeaways are that you're going to walk away and say, hey, if I don't understand what's in that GHG protocol or the TCFD recommendations or that corresponding ISSB S2 standard, now is the time to start to understand what those documents are, because they really are the kind of de facto standards for a lot of this climate impact and climate risk reporting. And then again, as I just said, please now take the time to understand what these triggers are for these rules and whether or not they pull you into applicability. And what's really important to think about here is you really need to consider your future growth. So as of today, you may not hit the $1 billion threshold for reporting GHG information, GHG emissions in California. But if your company's growth plan has you getting there in the next year or two, now again is the time to get started. And then one thing I didn't mention in the discussion, even if you don't trigger these California rules or kind of some of these other rules, if you are a company that supplies to a company that does trigger these rules, you might get pressure or demands from those customers of yours to do this reporting, even if you're not regulatorily required. And I won't go into the details there, but if your scope 3 emissions could be someone else's scope 1 emissions. So even if you decide you're not, these rules aren't applicable to you, don't be surprised if your customers or maybe your investors are still asking you to do these reports. To be successful here, you can't do this alone. This isn't something that an environmental function or a sustainability function can do on its own. Successful disclosures are really going to require engagement throughout the business, really pulling in stakeholders and really trying to integrate what you're doing into the business. So it's part of what you do when it comes to reporting. And then again, these last two points here, I know I've said them a lot, but I'm going to say it one final time. Do not take comfort in the fact that the SEC laws are currently stayed or that there's a risk of the CARB implementing regulations be delayed. In my mind, this time is a gift. And this is really the time to get started on what will be a very heavy lift and a very long journey for folks. So if you take away anything, it's at least please take a look at these rules, reach out to me if you'd like, and figure out what is applicable for you so that you can get your arms around what you need to do and start putting a plan in place. Okay, so with that, Jessica, I think we've got just over 10 minutes or so for questions.
We do.
I haven't been monitoring the Q&A, so I will defer to you.
That sounds good. And we've had well over 10 questions come in, so I guarantee you we're not going to have a chance to get to all of them. For the attendees, we are going to try to answer the more broad questions during today's event. We'll try to get to some more of the specific ones. But don't worry, as Jamie said, feel free to reach out to her afterwards. And a survey is also going to come up on your screen at the end of the event. So feel free to add additional questions after we close out. So this one kind of goes along with your key takeaways and the delays. So are there any updates expected on these disclosures? And if so, what is the best way to stay ahead and prepare for any upcoming updates?
Great question. So just to be clear, the EU CSRD, that is enacted, it's in full force, it's rolling along. So that is, again, for US companies, most of us won't be triggered until 2029, but that is a final rule. For the SEC, I've been trying to keep ahead of it. And really right now we're waiting for the courts to kind of take up this case. Really, there haven't even been any kind of, that I've heard, any kind of rumors about when that might be. So I don't really have anything to kind of predict there. For the state of California, because the California Air Resources Board, through those Senate bills, was or is required to implement regulations by January 1st of next year, I suspect around January 1st, right before or right after, we will hear something a little bit more definitive about the timing of those implementing regulations. Now, as far as how to stay up to date, I use a couple of different channels. So, some things as simple as, kind of Google alerts and kind of news alerts, but there's also just some great kind of environmental and sustainability focused newsletters that are out there. So hit me up. I've got my email address on the screen here. If you'd like to learn more, let me know. We also, I guess, lastly, I'll mention, we have a landing page that you can get to with the QR code here. We've been publishing a series of blogs about each of these different frameworks. We will also use that page to share any information that we learn about how the SEC rules or the California rules progress. So make sure to bookmark that page, and we'll keep folks posted that way as well.
And I was on mute there. So great. Thank you for that, Jamie. Do you expect other states to kind of follow suit, follow California's lead when it comes to some of these more specific requirements?
Mm. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, so please don't hold me to anything. Um, I my short answer is yes, but I also think that a lot is going to depend on what happens with the SEC rules. I think if we see the SEC rules move forward in a more timely fashion, we might not see as much action from the states because those disclosures are going to get driven through the SEC rules. However, if the SEC rules get caught up in the courts and it's 6 months or a year from now and there's not a lot of action, then I absolutely predict that we will see other states following California's lead.
That's kind of what I expected your answer to say, but you don't have a crystal ball, as you said as
Yeah.
well. So, this question actually just came in. There are some requirements that require all stages of the supply chain to meet GHG. What happens in this case, given that there are usually several parties along the supply chain? And this is a
Another
very
great question.
complicated question.
Yes, it is. It is. And again, I just want to offer to folks on the webinar, please feel free to reach out to me directly. But maybe a quick kind of calculating emissions 101. For those more direct emissions, not the value chain emissions, we typically look at activity data and apply an emissions factor. So how much electricity did I use? Multiply those kilowatt hours times an emissions factor, that's your emissions. Well, it's as the person asking suspects, it's much more complicated when you're trying to look at emissions related to your supply chain and your full value chain. Depending on the organization, its maturity, the maturity of your procurement process, a lot of companies are choosing to start with what we would call a spend-based method. So you can look at, for example, your suppliers, identify those suppliers that you do the most business with, and then you can work with that supplier to kind of develop what is sort of like an emission factor to say, okay, for X number of dollars, we anticipate these many emissions, and then you can apply that for all your spend. So it's a little bit less based on activity data, more based on, again, what we're seeing to start spend data. In a more mature supply chain, what we're seeing is companies actually asking their suppliers or eventually demanding that their suppliers calculate their own scope 1 and scope 2 GHG emissions so that companies can actually kind of more accurately figure out what of those emissions are related to their supply chain and capture those there. So things are moving more away from the spend-based method, but Absolutely. Again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You can start with your biggest suppliers, your biggest customers, use those as kind of rules of thumb to apply for the rest of your supply chain and value chain. And then every year, just work towards improving your data. And then the last thing I'll say there is document, 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 and transparency, transparency, transparency. So this isn't about, again, getting it perfect. It's about making the best effort, documenting what you're doing, and being transparent about how you're doing it so that your stakeholders have line of sight of what's actually happening.
Fantastic advice. And it's advice that I've heard from you before, as well as other people in this space, other experts in this space, is just start. Again, perfection is not attainable, and you just have to start and again document and being transparent. Now, in your experience, this question, it's going to go back to the one that you just answered, but how do you help companies effectively calculate emissions for their employees who are working remotely? Because it's so much more prevalent now that, in the post-COVID world.
It absolutely is. And the greenhouse gas protocol standards for scope 3 emissions, which is where like employee commuting sits, those were written before COVID. And so they don't really specifically address working from home emissions. Now, the greenhouse gas protocol documents are expected to be updated soon. I can't recall the timeline off the top of my head. So I do anticipate seeing more guidelines there. Again, for now, it's not necessarily a one size fits all answer. I would really, think a little bit about the percentage of employees that work from home and whether that's material to the overall organization. And again, think about how their work from home is displacing electricity use, in the offices. And Jessica, if I can chime in here, I do see a question that came in on the chat that I'd like to answer just because I think it is one that I've seen before, and so others may have it as well, if you
Yes,
don't mind.
definitely.
So a question came in that says, if a company only has 10% of their operations in California, will SB 261, or let's just say one of the California climate bills, require reporting on the remaining 90% or just the 10% of facilities in California? Great question. The reporting that is required, whether it's for SB 261 or SB 253, is for the whole business. So SB 261, here specifically, it's about the risk that is posed to your business due to climate change. And so they don't want to know the risk to your California business. They want to know the risk to your business overall, because it's really about the sustainability and longevity and resilience of the business itself. And so, for example, if I'm a stakeholder, I'm an investor, I want to know how you're managing your risk. I don't want to know just how you're managing it in California. I want to know how you're managing it for the whole organization. And then similarly on the impact side, it's not just California-based emissions, it's all emissions.
No, I'm glad. I was going to pull that one up, but you beat me to it because I saw that in there a little bit ago. All right, we probably have time for one more question. This one, how can I make sure I'm following the requirements for all standards? Should I focus on CSRD requirements since those rules are so stringent and those rules are quite encompassing?
Short answer, yes. So if you know already that you are subject to CSRD and that climate will be a material topic, which I will say it will be very difficult for companies to say climate is not material, then CSRD and that ESRS E1 standard really are the most stringent and really are all encompassing. So I definitely would use those as your standard, but you definitely need to make sure you're paying attention to the timing of the SEC rules and the California rules, because that timing for those rules is likely to come into effect before the timing for the CSRD rules. And Jessica, I'm going to add one little asterisk on that that I didn't hit on before, but be aware that the SEC rules, some of what the SEC rules require, they only require you to disclose certain things if you have them in place. So there is some consideration to timing that while you might use the requirements of the CSRD to determine what you need to do, you may need to be a little bit thoughtful about the timing of those disclosures, because once you disclose something, for example, disclosing goals and targets for GHG emissions reductions, then you have to report those through the SEC rules. Whereas if you don't have those in place, you're not required to report them. So there are some nuances. And again, happy for folks to jot down my email address, my phone number, reach out, happy to have a conversation. Every company is different. There are lots of nuances here. But if you take away one message, it's just get started.
Get started. Oh, I mean, that's a perfect way to end today's event. And something tells me we're going to have you back on talking about this more over the, over the
Sounds
coming
great.
months
I'd be happy to.
and years. So I want to thank all attendees for actively participating in today's event. We had so many incredible questions and comments come in, and it makes the event better for the speakers, better for everybody, you know, as the more participation that we have. So again, Jamie, thank you to your team and the entire team at Montrose for all the work that you always put into these events. And again, this event's going to be available on demand. Feel free, come back and watch it as at your leisure. If you are watching this on demand for the first time, still feel free to submit questions. We will send any questions after the event to the team at Montrose. And again, any feedback, we appreciate the team at E&E Leader as well as Montrose. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we look forward to the next event with you, Jamie.
Great. Thanks all. Have a good
Thank
day.
you.